Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Environmental Justice Now. Before we get started today, I'd like to do a brief land acknowledgement. But first, if you don't know already, my name is Leah Jones, and I am the Education Coordinator here at VIPL. And thank you for tuning in to another episode this Friday. To get us started, like usual, we will be doing a brief land acknowledgement. While we are on a video call and many of us are joining from different places, we want to remind ourselves that we gather on the unceded land of the indigenous peoples. I'm joining in from so called Richmond, Virginia, and I am currently located on the land of the Powhatan and Chickahominy peoples. If you are unsure whose land you are on and would like to find out, you can visit native-land.ca to find out. On this week's episode, we will be discussing the COP26 UN Climate Change Conference, which has been making headlines in the news since the conference began last week. After walking through what COP26 is and its purpose, we will then highlight some of the environmental justice implications to consider and keep in mind throughout the duration of this conference. Furthermore, we wanted to use this conference where all countries all over the globe are coming together as an opportunity to begin the conversation of how Black, Indigenous, and people of color's voices have been and continue to be erased from the dialogue of working towards solving the global climate crisis. This conference has been meeting a little longer than my lifetime annually, and yet there has been minimal progress in addressing the climate crisis, and its effects have only gotten worse. Since this conference of the parties began, concrete solutions followed by meaningful action have yet to be taken, especially in the countries like the United States, where we are, the UK, and China, who create the greatest amount of carbon emissions, leaving the global south and developing nations to feel the negative effects of climate change the most. In case you need a little background on what the UN Climate Change Conference and COP is, here are the details. For nearly 3 decades now, the UN has been bringing together almost every country on Earth for global climate summits called COPs, which stands for Conference of the Parties. In that time, climate change has gone from being a fringe issue to a global priority. This year is the 26th annual summit, giving it its name, COP26. With the UK as president, COP26 takes place this year in Glasgow, Scotland. In the run up to COP26, the UK is working with every nation to reach an agreement on how to tackle climate change. World leaders have arrived in Scotland alongside tens of thousands of negotiators, government representatives, businesses, and citizens for 12 days of talks focused on addressing climate change and reducing emissions. Not only is this a huge task, but it is also not just another international summit. Most experts believe that COP26 has a unique urgency this year, especially as we continue to see the impacts and effects of climate change only becoming more severe all over the world and here at home as well, which at this point we can easily see in Virginia with new record setting temperatures every year and the consistent flooding we've seen all over the state. To further understand why this conference of the parties is so important, it's really also helpful to look back at past COPs. Let's take COP21 that took place in Paris, France in 2015, for example. For the first time ever at that conference, something momentous happened. Every country agreed to work together to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, which and aim for 1.5 degrees Celsius to adapt to the impacts of a changing climate and to make money available to deliver on these aims. This is crucial because if the warming of the planet reaches 2 degrees Celsius, more than 70% of the Earth's coastlines will see sea level rise greater than 0.66 feet, resulting in increased coastal flooding, beach erosion, salinization of water supplies, and other impacts on humans and ecological systems. Basically, unlocking Pandora's box to unravel the well being of our environments and homes as we know it. At COP21, a treaty named the Paris Agreement was born to make reaching this goal possible. The commitment to aim for 1.5 degrees is important because every fraction of a degree of warming will result in the loss of many more lives and livelihoods damaged. Under the Paris Agreement, countries committed to bring forward national plans setting out how much they would reduce their emissions. This is also known as the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. They agreed that every 5 years they would come back with an updated plan that would reflect their highest possible ambition at that time. Now, fast forwarding to COP26, during this year's summit in Glasgow is the moment, which once again was delayed by a year due to the pandemic last year, is an opportunity for countries to update their plans for reducing emissions. But that's not all. The commitments laid out in the Paris Agreement did not come close to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And the window for achieving this is closing quicker and quicker at this point. This entire decade up until 2030 will be extremely crucial in addressing the climate crisis. So, as momentous as Paris was, countries must go much farther than they did, even at that historic summit, in order to keep the hope of holding temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. COP26 needs to be decisive and full of meaningful action. The COP26 UN Climate Change Conference, hosted by the UK in partnership with Italy, is taking place from October 31st to the 12th of November in Scottish Event Campus, which is in Glasgow, UK. In light of the worldwide effects of COVID-19, the COP Bureau of the UNFCCC, with the UK and its Italian partners, had decided to reschedule the conference that was initially planned for November of last year in 2020. In rescheduling the conference, the Bureau is hoping that all parties can focus on the issues to be discussed at this vital conference, and also hopefully allow more time for the necessary preparations to take place for the conference before it began. On the official COP26 website, it states that the parties will continue to work with all involved to increase climate ambition, build resilience, and lower emissions. As to what will actually be accomplished during this conference, everyone all over the world will have to wait and see as new pledges, agreements, and investments are made. Some of the biggest updates we can clue you all into right now, though, include a pivotal pledge to save and restore our planet's forests, which was officially announced on November 2nd, just this week, which was the second day of the COP26 World Leaders Summit. And with that deal came a long list of commitments from the public and private sectors, actors to combat climate change, curb biodiversity destruction and hunger, and protect Indigenous peoples' rights. Another big update is that just yesterday, more than 40 countries committed to shift away from coal. Major coal-using countries, including Poland, Vietnam, and Chile, are among those to make this commitment. But some of the world's biggest coal-dependent countries, including China and the United States, did not sign up to join this pledge. This is very disappointing considering how badly we need to justly transition to renewable energy sources and the fact that coal is still the single biggest contributor to climate change. The United States did not sign on to this pledge, but made a commitment to pledge to end the public financing for unabated fossil fuel projects abroad by the end of 2022. The end of 2022. This commitment is a bit vague and does not address our carbon emissions here in the United States, so hopefully a clearer, more impactful pledge will be taken before the conference is over. So how does this all connect to environmental justice? A recent study has come out affirming that the total carbon footprint of the richest 1% in the world will continue to grow, while the carbon footprint of the poorest 50% in the world will stay small. Emissions of the wealthiest are on track to be 30 times higher than what's needed to stop the planet from warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius, according to the study. Though the poorest of the world will contribute the least to carbon emissions, the poorest 50% will be most severely impacted by climate change. The large emissions of the world's richest are fueling the extreme weather events that we have been seeing all over the world and will only continue to worsen. Additionally, the richest are putting the global goal of limiting global heating at an extreme risk. Achieving the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal will not be possible without considerable reductions in emissions from the world's wealthiest population. An interesting point to highlight in making this observation about the wealthiest and the poorest populations in the world is the fact that the study also exposes that the 1% are not just billionaires or really even millionaires. It includes anyone earning over $172,000. This study also looked at the world's richest 10%, which is anyone earning over $55,000, and found that emissions were still high. The richest 10% of the world will emit 9 times more carbon than their share if we were to globally split up our emissions per person evenly. Crazy, right? We have another graphic to share with you all showcasing how unequal our emissions were in the 1990 compared to what is projected for 2030. Once again, we can see here in this graph that it's further emphasized the effects that the richest of the world's population will have on greenhouse gas emissions. BBC recently reviewed this study in an article in which they break down this difference on a day-to-day scale by evaluating everyday people in different parts of the world. One example within the article it shares is the experience of a family in the top 10% of the world's richest. The Kurtz, who is a family of 5 that lives in the suburbs of Toledo, Ohio. Tracy Kurth, her husband, and her teenage daughter each drive a car. Comparing this to an English teacher named Togonin Savirin Togo, who lives in Katy, Mali, in Africa, life is quite different, actually. Like 80% of the people in the world, he actually doesn't have a car at all. He travels to work on his moped. In his opinion, cars are considered to be for rich people. This is such a stark and easy comparison to show how easily Western countries drastically contribute to our global carbon emissions. The fact that this is the case reveals a clear justice issue in approaching solutions to the global climate crisis. So, how do we plan to address this injustice, not just in the United States, but as a society all over the globe? Time after time, we've come up short, and now many of us are looking to the youth and future generations for solutions to work towards climate justice. So, as we consider the youth, today is actually an important day in the COP26 conference. It is the Youth and Public Empowerment Day. Youth and Public Empowerment Day at COP is centered on how to engage the public, and particularly young people, in tackling climate issues and helping bring about systematic change at the policy level. A clear issue that arises in the context of this day of the conference is obviously how we are working towards a better earth for our future generations. One large issue that we are still seeing in this conversation around climate change and climate solutions, according to the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, is that many people around the world still don't know about climate change and aren't very worried about the impacts it may have. A survey conducted by the Yale Climate Change Communication and Facebook in 31 countries earlier this year found that 44% of respondents either never heard of or knew a little about the subject of climate change. According to the survey, roughly 2/3 of the respondents in Colombia, Costa Rica, and Mexico were very worried about climate change. However, in Britain and in the United States, that figure was below 1/3. This aligns with the general trend that internationally, people in developing countries tend to see climate change more as a pressing problem than those in modernized Western countries because it affects their day-to-day life. There is a serious need for education and awareness on a global scale about climate change and the dangers and injustices that come with this crisis. It doesn't help that this issue, especially in America, is heavily politicized, when as a society, we should all be tackling climate change together, seeing as we share the same earth and all. The news is the good news, however, is that in younger demographics, there is less denial of the climate crisis and a greater initiative to take action on climate change and build a better future, build a better earth for all of our futures. Thus far at COP26, there has been mobilization and protests led by youth and specifically young women. On Thursday, more than a dozen young climate activists staged a protest inside of the conference center. They stood in a crowded hallway and they chanted, "Whose planet? Our planet. Whose future? Our future. Whose water? Our water. Whose air? Our air." Here is a video giving a snapshot of the various protests that we have seen that have been happening since the conference began just last week.
COP is trying to be about more than men in suits, but sometimes there is room for an exception. Leonardo DiCaprio has been campaigning for years with his own foundation, pressuring world leaders to do more on climate change. In Glasgow right now, he has a captive audience and plenty of interest in whatever he does. Sometimes it takes a bit of star quality in town to make the message more appealing. Former F1 champion Nico Rosberg is trying to pile on the pressure for global investment in electric cars, and he believes sport can lead the way.
Formula One needs to be a role model in that sense, to then hopefully also inspire everybody who's following the sport and to think about it and say, hey, why don't I also do my little bit and contribute to this movement? That's essentially a big important goal, and it's possible.
Celebrities find it easier to get the ear of presidents and prime ministers. Climate activists usually have to try other means to be heard. Extinction Rebellion today blockaded the entrance to the conference and closed a whole bridge. The most famous climate activist in the world has also been getting her message across away from COP. Greta Thunberg inspired a new generation of mostly young women who are here to be heard above the mostly men inside the conference rooms. Among their number is OEO, the first school striker in China.
I think it's really important that Greta also passing the mic to the activists in the global south, because they are the people who are experiencing the suffering. The last 2 years of the striking, my voices have shared to over millions of people in China and also in other countries. It gives the millions of people a hope that a young woman, she can do so much things and to get her voice heard.
Lack of action inside COP is why so many alternative voices feel the need to step in now on the streets right outside. Peter Smith, News at 10, Glasgow.
In addition to these demonstrations, there have also been a few others that are creative and have strayed away from the norm, using popular culture as a way to uplift climate justice and grab folks' attention. Here's another example.
We've put together an action today that is riffing off the famous Squid Games TV show to tell leaders to stop playing climate games with our future. They made a brilliant speeches yesterday with a lot of rhetoric and a lot of promises, but that doesn't change the trajectory of emissions. And what we need is for them to go home and deliver on those promises, to deliver action that changes people's lives, but also affects the climate emissions and stops new fossil fuel infrastructure, delivers new green jobs for millions of working people in this country and billions more around the world. That's the type of transformative action that we need.
People living in the countries most impacted by climate change are frequently people of color. As the young boy, how you just mentioned in the first video that we played, we need the voices of those who are most impacted to be at the forefront leading this movement. However, often what we see instead are these voices being muffled and frequently erased within the greater climate movement, even on a global scale. We see this happening right now, even at this year's COP26 conference, just by looking at the attendance list. The broadcast Democracy Now! Reported that this year's UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow may be the whitest and most privileged one ever, with thousands from the global south unable to attend because of a lack of access to the COVID-19 vaccines and travel restrictions. Climate activist Dipti Bhaktanagar in Mozambique pointed out that in the global inequity in vaccine access mirrors the disproportionate impact of the climate crisis that has fallen mostly on poor countries least responsible for emissions. She goes on to say that the people who need to be there, who need to hold people accountable, are not going to be there. And what is going to come out of this COP is going to be largely illegitimate because of the way they've organized it and because of the intentions behind it. Evaluating her points, we must consider how effective this year's conference is really going to be with the absence of its most important voices and perspectives. The people most impacted by climate change and living through its effects right now. Will this year's conference be a waste of a massive opportunity to take meaningful and life-changing action on climate before it's too late? Another example of erasure that we can point to is who is at the forefront of this beautiful new wave of young climate activists. We see someone like Greta Thunberg, who has been an awesome and inspiring voice in the movement to act on climate, especially for younger generations. But are there other young activists that are of color that are not getting as much attention or the larger platform when addressing the climate crisis? The answer is yes. We wanted to take the time now to share a couple of other global activists that have been fighting climate change and are valuable perspectives to consider in the plan to tackle climate change and get you motivated to act on climate. An easy example is Isra Hirsi, who is a climate activist and daughter of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and is the co-executive director of the U.S. Youth Climate Strike. Another woman of color making waves in the global climate movement, especially in Africa, is Ugandan activist Vanessa Nakate, who has been literally erased from photos in some cases and is urgently reminding world leaders of their responsibilities to future generations. She also actually has a new book coming out called A Bigger Picture: My Fight to Bring a New African Voice to the Climate Crisis, highlighting the struggles that she's recognized as a person living in a country most impacted by climate change. So to begin to close us out on this week's episode, I'd like to now share a video of Vanessa at COP26 just taken a couple days ago of her speaking to this issue. Mm-hmm.
I can first talk about the $100 billion finance, climate finance, that has been delayed until 2023. So it's hard for me to have hope for new finances being promised, and yet what was already promised has not yet been delivered. I feel like what we are getting from the leaders, it's continuous empty promises, it's continuous empty words, it's continuous empty phrases, showing us that we can have hope with their words, but in the end, these words are not implemented into action. So I don't really have hope that we will see that money being implemented if the $100 billion climate finance has still been delayed for countries who are on the front lines of the climate crisis but are not responsible for this crisis.
Yeah, delayed by at least 3 years now. So your skepticism is obviously warranted. Talk about your start in activism on the streets there of Kampala in Uganda a few years ago. What is it around you and your environment, what you saw on a daily life perspective in your reality that made you become this activist?
The climate crisis is a present reality in my country, Uganda. My country heavily depends on agriculture for survival, for many communities, for many families, and for the economy itself. But with the rising global temperatures, we are seeing changes in weather patterns. We are experiencing more extreme rainfall, more extreme droughts, and this means that too much rain is a lot of destruction of farms, people's homes, people's businesses, hospitals and schools. And the lack of rain, it means hunger, starvation, and death for very many communities. So the climate crisis is a present reality for a country that is not responsible for this crisis. But not just in Uganda, across Africa, the climate crisis is ravaging different parts of the African continent, which is ironic given that Africa is only responsible for 3% of global emissions.
You said that everybody, every leader that comes to the conference, that speaks out, that makes pledges, needs to address a quote unquote ticking clock that is climate change and the perils of it on humanity. And without that, that their words are meaningless. Explain more about that.
Climate change is more than weather. Climate change is more than statistics. Climate change is more than data points. Climate change is more than 1.5 degrees. Climate change is about the people. And that is what I want the leaders to understand, that climate change is destroying livelihoods of very many people right now.
Climate change is destroying the livelihoods of very many people right now. Let's encourage a commitment to global action on climate change while uplifting our neighbors who need the action on climate change the most. One way that we can show our support here in Virginia is by calling our state representatives, urging them to support the Build Back Better Act, encouraging investments in clean energy and healthy communities. Congressional leaders are moving toward a vote on the Build Back Better Act, and we have heard whispers saying that the vote might be happening today. So be on the lookout and call your representatives. This historic act, when passed, will deliver the largest investment in childcare and early education in history, address the existential threat of climate change, cut taxes, and reduce some of the largest expenses for workers and families. This act represents the most realistic and achievable path for addressing the climate crisis, cutting carbon pollution, delivering action on environmental justice, reducing energy bills for working families, and creating millions of high-quality union jobs. On that note, I will say thank you for watching. I hope you learned something today about COP26 and the erasure of Black voices, Indigenous voices, people of color's voices, and the global climate crisis and movement. And I hope that you all will return to this video and return next week for next week's episode. Please stay tuned in with the latest climate and environmental justice news by joining in on our newsletter and becoming a supporter of VAIPL. What we are up to will always be within our e-news and on our website. So please check us out, and we will see you all next week. Thank you.